When we're beginning directors and we're doing it all, some things can be challenging on set, and audio is one of those things. For example, if we've got our shotgun mic on a stand to record our actor, and then we're hitting record on a field recorder, and then running the camera, some things can happen. For example, let's say your actor turns away from the mic while they're speaking. Well, as you can hear right now, the audio drops off. A boom operator, called first assistant sound nowadays, can follow your talent so that that audio problem doesn't happen. If you don't have a sound mixer monitoring levels, you can peak in a take, things like that. Fortunately, the MixPre has some things built into it that can help us with these challenges. But to use these items, we have to be running in advanced mode. There's 3 modes on this field recorder: basic, advanced, and custom. Custom's sort of a hybrid between the two. I never use custom. I'm either operating in basic or advanced. You don't have to operate in advanced. As we've talked about, basic is really dialed in for filmmaking. It's giving us 24-bit WAV files at a 48K sample rate. In fact, I shot all of Reckoning in basic mode. But there are some cool features in advanced, and so that's what we're going to talk about today. And the first one I want to talk about is isolated channels. For example, this field recorder, the MixPre III, can take up to 3 mics plugged in. So if I plug in 3 mics and hit record, it's going to give me the sound from all 3 mics crunched down to a left-right mix. The audio channels aren't isolated. And typically, if we're using multiple mics, we want those separate channels to work with in post. In fact, let me show you what this looks like so it makes more sense. So take a look at this audio. The first is running in basic mode with a single shotgun mic. It just gives me a left-right mix. The second set here is running in advanced mode with that single mic, and I have the left-right mix, but I also have a channel 1. So that's an isolated channel. Now with one mic, it's irrelevant, but if you had a second or third mic plugged in, then you would have those mics on isolated channels as well, and that's what we want. So we're going to enable advanced mode on the MixPre, and we're going to go through working with isolated channels and also using 32-bit float, which we'll talk about in a second. So let's get this thing in advanced mode. Go to the menu, then go to the third screen, System, and then Mode. Select Advanced. And a little note on this: before you go from one mode to the next, it's good to drop your fader down if you have a mic plugged into your field recorder, because sometimes there can be a big audio difference. Great, now we're in advanced mode. Hit the home icon. On the main screen, you're going to see the left-right mix represented. But now if you tap the display once, you'll see the mix and any isolated channels that you have. Now see the color there by the channels. Red means the channel is enabled and armed, which means it's recording. Gray means it's enabled but not armed, so it's not recording. Black means the channel is completely disabled. Let's hit our first fader. You'll have new options now that you didn't have in basic mode. Let's go through all of these. Solo means it's going to solo the channel to the headphones only, and this applies to monitoring. It does not affect your recording. And then your fader is going to flash orange like this when it's soloed. Mute actually mutes the channel, and this does apply to recording, and it'll be highlighted in red on the fader to signify that it's been muted. So if you have multiple mics plugged in and you want to mute one of them or solo one to the headphones, this is where you do that. ARM activates isolated mode, which records a separate track for the channel. So you'll have the left-right mix, and then you're going to get an isolated track like we've already seen in Resolve. In advanced mode, we have trim gain and fader gain. This is trim gain, and it applies to this specific isolated channel, while your fader controls the gain on the entire mix. Now, I'm going to demo that in a second, but a little side note here. You can use the little headphone volume knob when you're in settings like this to also make adjustments. Moving on, pan. In advanced mode, pan is continuously variable. What does that mean? It means it's not just left, center, or right like basic mode. It can actually be in between those things. Low cut allows you to adjust the frequency in advanced mode, something you can't do in basic mode. Input, as you already know, is where we set the type of input for the channel. Phantom power is for mics that need it. So most shotgun mics that you're going to use, like the Sennheiser that I use, requires phantom power from the field recorder in order to work. Phase can be normal or invert. Phase inversion, also known as polarity reversal, can be used to prevent signal cancellation when a source is dual mic'd from like opposite directions. It can also help with other things like bad cables, stuff like that. I never used delay, but from what I've read about this, it has to do with certain scenarios on set where you're trying to time your audio with other devices, maybe a camera, whatever, and you need a specific delay as it's going out of the field recorder. So if I've read the correct information, that's what this setting is about. Linking will link channels 1 and 2 into a stereo pair. You can also link them as a mid-side pair. If you're doing the mid-side pair, what that does is it links them together, and then you use channel 1's fader to adjust the gain, and channel 2's fader adjusts the balance between mid and side when you're recording. Okay, cool. So now let's set this up ready for use. I'm using one shotgun mic, so I'm going to isolate one channel. Let's take a look. So I'll set mic for the input, and I'm going to enable phantom power. No need to arm this if I'm just using a single mic because the mix would be fine. But I'm talking now and I'm not getting any lights, no levels. What does that mean? Well, it's because the trim gain defaults to 6 decibels, which is too low. It's not going to pick that up. For example, the human ear hears around 30 to 120 decibels, and that's called dynamic range, by the way, just like with cameras. We've talked about that. The darkest and brightest points of capture is the camera's dynamic range. Well, in audio, dynamic range is the difference between the softest and loudest parts of your audio passage when you're recording. So we just need to up this channel and then we'll see our levels. So let's crank up our trim gain until we're peaking in the yellow for dialogue. This is going to be around -12 for dialogue peaks, which should show yellow on the display here. Now remember, trim gain affects this isolated channel only. For example, if you hit the fader to jump out of the settings, you can see that we've got levels on the left-right mix and the isolated channel. But if I lower the levels with my fader, it applies to the mix, whereas the channel stays high. But since we haven't armed this channel, we're really only recording the mix. If we want to record the isolated channel, even as a safety, we need to go in and arm the channel. Red signifies that our channel 1 is armed. So we're recording the left-right mix and we're recording the isolated channel. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? If I can have isolated channels with various mics, that can help me in situations where I don't have a first assistant sound, a boom operator. If my actors are moving around on a set or even moving their head while speaking stationary, I can set up another shotgun mic, get the same one you're using. So if you're using the Sennheiser, get another one, and you can have 2 mics or 3 mics with stands and potentially avoid some audio issues. And you might be thinking, whoa, those Sennheiser mics are $1,000 each. That's a lot of money. But if you're paying a first assistant sound, their day rate, that adds up pretty fast. So just something to consider to help with this as directors wearing all the hats. Okay, so what's next? Well, the next thing we need to do is change some basic menu settings in advanced mode. So let's check that out. Go to Menu, Second Screen, Time Code, Frame Rate. We've already talked about this because you have to do it in basic mode too, but set it to the frame rate you're running at. So if we're doing narrative film, we're typically doing 24 frames here in the US. So go ahead and choose that here. Next, go to Menu again, Second Screen, and then Record. The first option on Record is Record Left, Right. The thing I want to make clear here is that these settings only apply to our left-right mix. So whether we're in basic mode or advanced mode, it's taking all the inputs and combining those into a left-right mix. And it's not a stereo mix, it's just 2 mono tracks centered. Even if you only have one mic plugged into the field recorder, it's going to create a left and a right track centered by default. An important side note on this, and I don't know if this is a bug or if there's a setting I'm not aware of, but when you bring audio into Resolve, your left and right mix is represented by 2 mono-centered tracks. And then if you have any armed, isolated channels, those show up as separate tracks as well. So you might be tempted to think, hey, I'll disable one of the mix buses, so I just have one mono track for the mix and then separate mono tracks for my isolated channels. The problem is this. If I leave my left mix bus enabled and then arm channel 1, it combines both of them into a single mono track like this. For example, if I right-click on this mono track and change it to stereo, look, I can see my left mix and my channel 1. They're combined, which is very strange to me. So my recommendation is to just leave left and right mix bus enabled at the defaults and then arm any channels that you want, and then it will look like this, where you have your 2 mono tracks for the mix and then your separate mono tracks for each armed channel. Okay, next is sample rate. Make sure your sample rate is set to 48K. So why would you go up to 192K? Well, here's a reason. If you're doing some type of special recording for audio that you want to manipulate in post, like maybe you want to lengthen the time span of the sound, but you want to minimize distortion, then try doing that at 192K. You might get a better result. But again, filmmaking, dialogue, always 48K. Now let's go to the second screen, bit depth. Change this from 24 to 32-bit float. So 32-bit float, what is this about? Well, technically, when you're recording using 24-bit WAV files, if something gets really loud on set and someone's not manning the faders, you could peak your audio. And peaked audio is not recoverable in post-production. I've even heard peaked audio in one of my favorite studio films. It was an amazing performance by an actor, and it peaked a little bit. But I didn't catch it the first few times watching it, but at some point I'm like, hey, wait a minute, that audio peaked. So 32-bit float is designed to do away with that. And by the way, on the studio film, they probably didn't ADR that because their performance was so good, they would have lost the magic trying to ADR it and fix it that way. So they left it and just worked with it. And I think that was definitely the better choice. 32-bit float, in theory, will not peak. So I could run in that mode, hit record, not monitor the levels, and the files should be just fine. You can Google this and nerd out on the topic all you want. It's very technical, and you might even get opinions from other sound mixers saying, hey, always use 32-bit float, or you don't necessarily need to. We're going to do our own test in a second, but I will say this. This field recorder has really nice analog limiters. So what are those? If I talk into this mic too loud, you're going to see the fader turn orange. And that means the limiters are kicking in. They're keeping the audio from peaking. And it does a really, really good job at that. Again, like I've said, I shot all my last film using basic mode, which is 24-bit files. And sometimes I didn't have a sound mixer and I was okay. The other thing to know about this is when you're operating in 32-bit float mode, the audio, or the limiters rather, are not engaged. And so you will see the fader go red. And that means the audio is peaking, but 32-bit float should be protecting that, which is what we're going to find out. So let's do a record. I'm just going to say a line. I'm not going to shout into the mic because if you shout, if a noise is too loud into some microphones, the mic itself could clip. So I'm just going to say a sentence, but very close to the mic, and I'm going to crank up the gain on this, and I might do two sets, one sort of at a medium high, and then one with just everything cranked all the way up, and we'll see what happens. Here we go. We've got 3 sets of audio using both 24-bit with analog limiters and 32-bit float. Each of these sets begins with a 24-bit block, and then it's followed with a 32-bit float block. And keep in mind, this isn't a completely scientific test. I just did approximated gain comparisons on these. So what I'm doing, I'm speaking a line close to the mic, and then I'm using the fader on the MixPre to increment the gain up. And on the first set, I set the fader so that the analog limiters were just kicking in, just turning orange. Then on the second set, I cranked the gain up quite a bit. And then on the third set, I turned the fader all the way up. And as you can see, we've got some majorly clipped audio on the 32-bit WAV files. So just by the visual timeline here, we can see that the analog limiters seem to be protecting the audio. But now let's listen to them and see what happened. After the midpoint, the hero takes their first step towards change. After the midpoint, the hero takes their first step towards change. Okay, so the 32-bit float file sounds a little better to me. Let's listen to the next set. After the midpoint, the hero makes their first step towards change. So this 24-bit file isn't nearly as good as the first one. And that's to be expected because I had the gain cranked up quite a bit. As you can see, the analog limiters are doing their job. None of the audio has been destroyed. But the noise floor has been raised quite a bit, and we can hear some compression type stuff happening on the dialogue. Listen to it again. After the midpoint, the hero makes their first step towards change. Compared to, after the midpoint, the hero takes their first step towards change. So there's a lot of difference there. Sure, we haven't technically lost data. It hasn't clipped, but it doesn't sound that great. Let's listen to the 32-bit one. The way 32-bit float works, we should be able to lower the volume down on this and see the waveform preserved and not clipped. Let's try it out. Look at that. It truly is all there. Let's listen to it. After the midpoint, the hero makes their first step towards change. Wow, impressive. Okay, let's check the final set. And again, remember, I have the fader turned all the way up. All of this audio should be destroyed. After the midpoint, the hero takes their first step towards change. So once again, the analog limiters have done their job. It hasn't technically peaked, but the noise floor is completely unbearable and there's a lot of compression happening on the dialogue, so it's just not usable. Let's listen to the 32-bit float option. Like we just did, we're going to lower the volume. Whoa, would you look at that? No distortion, it's all there. Let's listen to it. After the midpoint, the hero takes their first step towards change. So wow, 32-bit float is incredible. Those files should have been completely destroyed. And even though the limiters do a really good job, and for normal scenarios on set with just some slightly loud dialogue, the limiters are going to do you well. But outside of that, when you're wearing a lot of hats and you don't have someone manning the faders, you put this field recorder in 32-bit float mode, and you can just rest at ease knowing that you're going to be okay. All right, next we're going to talk about pre-roll. Let's check it out. So pre-roll is very cool. Imagine you're in an environment where sounds are sporadic, and by the time you hear something and hit the record button, it's too late. Well, if you enable pre-roll, you can record audio constantly, even though you're not technically in record mode. And then when you do hit the record button, it adds that audio to the beginning of your file. With the MixPre at the latest firmware version, you can record up to 10 seconds of pre-roll, which is amazing. Okay, now go back to settings and you'll see LR stereo by the headphones icon. If you hit that, you can change your headphones to either play mono or other modes. And again, this doesn't affect recording. This is just for monitoring on set. And if you jump over to the third screen here, you can set headphones solo to individual or multiple. So what's that about? Remember, in advanced mode, we can solo a channel when we're in the fader settings. By default, you can only solo one channel at a time to your headphones. But if you change the headphone solo setting to multiple instead of individual, you can solo more than one channel. And then they will both blink orange, signifying that they have been soloed. And then one last thing I want to look at in here, when you've got things set up the way you want them to be, you can save it as a preset, so you don't have to redo this all the time. Just go to Menu, Presets, and you can save up to 4 presets on your field recorder. Another thing you want to do is make sure any channels that you're not using are completely disabled. Not just disarmed, but disabled. This will save on battery life, but also avoid any weird signal interferences that I've read that can happen. I've not run into that, but just to be safe, disable them and avoid those potential problems. To disable the channel, hit the fader, go to the second screen, and change your input to off. And when you do that, the channel is officially disabled. And now our field recorder is ready to go in advanced mode with isolated channels and 32-bit float. And as you can see, for those of us who are aspiring filmmakers, indie filmmakers wearing a lot of hats, this is huge. When we can't afford crew to monitor levels or to follow actors around with a boom, we can still get by thanks to the technology built into this field recorder. Hopefully this has been helpful. And listen, if you like my training, you should check out my online film school, writedirect.co. Here it is in a nutshell. I did the normal thing, went to Los Angeles, went to film school, and you realize this sobering truth while you're there. Nobody's going to hire you to direct a movie after you graduate. Don't take my word for it. Call up any studio right now and say, hey, I just graduated from school name with honors, film degree. Do you have anything for me? They're going to say things to you like they said to me. We only hire award-winning people. It's a sobering reality to be dealt, because if you've spent a lot of money on film school and you don't have any left and you have to fund your own movies to get anywhere, that's a tough spot to be in. The goal of Write and Direct is to teach you the craft for a fraction of the cost of film school so that you can buy gear and start making movies. And I also teach you how to do it all from development through post-production. Why? Because you can't be reliant on technical people. First, you've got to master story, and you've got to learn the technical stuff so that if your sound guy doesn't show up one day, your production doesn't stall. If you can run sound, run the camera, set up your lighting, and do all these things, edit your movie, do color grading, etc., then you, as Robert Rodriguez says, you're truly unstoppable. And that's the only way to move forward to pursue your dreams as a filmmaker. So I hope to see you there, writedirect.co. And if not there, I'll see you in another lesson on the channel very soon.